Uh, this is the last part of our America's Beginning, and we're going to cover the Southern Colonies. Sections that we looked at. Of course, further south, the warmer the be. And you can see this is kind of a map showing the tide water. This is kind of the fall line for tide water, basically the bays coming in and so forth. And those areas are called the tidewater areas of these substates. So here's your chart. You can pause and fill this in, but you'll see the founders, John Smith. We've gone through Virginia. I'm going to do that very, very quickly. Lord Baltimore is the founder of Maryland, and this is a Catholic haven. And they are going to be the first to pass an act of toleration to protect Protestants. North and South Carolina were actually given charters to 8 different noblemen, and they came for economic opportunities. We'll talk about the specifics of that, but North Carolina actually was a little bit smaller farmers and more democratic. In the South Carolina, those large plantations and a very large slave population by the end of the 1700s. Georgia was founded by James Oglethorpe, and he actually got people out of debtor's prison in England and brought them over, much like they did with Australia. And so you had a whole lot of folks that were in prison and come over to Georgia, and they are offered the opportunity to work off their debt. It was basically set up as a buffer colony between South Carolina and Florida, and we were getting some crossover and some conflict with the Spanish. So Georgia was this colony that was kind of put in between that. So 1607, remember the 5 permanent colonies are set up along the southeastern seacoast of North America. They're all characterized by plantation agriculture, indentured and slave labor, a social hierarchy, aristocratic in many ways. It was a more sparse population. They didn't have those towns that were formed, those kind of tight-knit communities, and very little access to schools, churches, and government institutions like we saw with the House of Burgess. Okay, so these are characteristics of the plantation colonies. Tobacco and rice, and then indigo will be grown as well. Slavery is prominent in all the southern colonies. They start out with the indentured servitude, much like Virginia did, which was a large percentage of the population. And then the African slaves start arriving in 1619. About 14% of the population in Virginia was black by 1700. So you've got the gentry, you've seen the pictures of kind of plantation gentry, and this is where it starts. And are not very populated, mostly Protestant, but not a large church presence, not a large religious presence like there was in the New England colonies. And you had these people moving west quite a bit because the tobacco would deplete the soil rather quickly. Okay, so this is kind of just showing the crops that are being grown. You see the tobacco leaves up there in Richmond, tobacco and rice in North Carolina, as well as naval stores. You've got corn and pigs. This is a seaport, so they're supplying things for these ships. When you get down to South Carolina, you're getting the indigo, that blue dye, as well as rice and corn production. And then Georgia, the rice, indigo, and pigs. Okay, so society was very, very different in the South than it was in the New England colonies. New England had a pretty long life expectancy, maybe the cool climate, but people typically would live into their 60s and even 70s, where in the Southern colonies that was rare. They had a much lower life expectancy, mostly due to the prevalence of things like yellow fever. Dependence on indentured servitude and slavery, a weak family life, other than that strong family structure that you saw in New England, and this hierarchical structure where you had the rich farm plantation owners on down to the lowly poor white farmer, and then the indentured servants, and then the slaves. So they had definite hierarchy set up. Remember, the Quakers didn't believe in that sort of thing in Pennsylvania. Okay, so these are called the Chesapeake regions, and basically because of Chesapeake Bay. And so you've got Jamestown here, Williamsburg, going back up into up the Potomac River, present day Washington, D.C., and Maryland is considered one of the Chesapeake colonies. Okay, now I'm going to go really quickly with Jamestown. You can refer to the notes that we took earlier. The motive for creating Jamestown was money, and the Virginia Charter was, again, the significance was this is the first permanent colony that is going to be set up. And we talked about how the site that they picked, they thought it was ideal because of the port, but it turned out to be mosquito infested and not the ideal. So this is the reproduction of the original Jamestown. You see they ultimately, for protection, get a fence put up. It's kind of in a triangular fashion. This is Captain John Smith, and he has the famous slogan for these men that were out looking for gold instead of working. He who does not work shall not eat. They go through a very time. This is a reproduction of the houses that they built, which kind of look pretty cool. With the I like the roof. Okay, this is the English portrait of Pocahontas after she married John Rolfe, and their depiction of her father, Chief Powhatan. This is the famous story, which could have been fabricated, of John Smith claiming that Pocahontas saved him from being executed by Powhatan. And some people think maybe it was made up. Some think it was just a ceremony, that John Smith was never in actual danger. I guess we'll never really know for sure. But John Smith never wrote about this immediately. It was years later that he wrote, and he had a tendency for a bit of an exaggeration. So we talked about Pocahontas going to Jamestown. Some say she was kidnapped. Others say that she went willingly, and she became converted to Christianity, changes her name to Rebecca, and marries John Rolfe. John Rolfe is considered the savior of Jamestown, as he snuck in these seedlings of tobacco, and they found that the soil was perfect for growing tobacco in this region. Okay, then we talked about the House of Burgesses, the first official government body set up in the New World, and it consisted of the wealthy landowners. Okay, so that was the organization. You've got Governor Berkeley, who is going to be the royal governor. Ultimately, King James will revoke the Virginia Charter, and Virginia will become a royal colony. All right, Maryland, the other Chesapeake colony, it is going to be granted to Lord Baltimore under a charter, and he sought a haven for Catholics in the New World. Maryland is going to be known for the first Act of Toleration, and they are going to write this Act of Toleration to assure religious freedom to all Christians. Their real purpose, though, was they actually said anybody who denied the Holy Trinity would be put to death. And we'll look at some of the wording that was in that Act of Toleration. Okay, you can see here they talk about if anybody shall use or utter any reproachful speeches, words, or languages concerning the said Holy Trinity, or any of the said three persons thereof, shall be punished with death and confiscation or forfeiture of all his or her lands and goods to the Lord Propriety and his heirs. So pretty strong language here. But then they say anybody who believes in Jesus Christ shall never be molested, troubled, discountenanced, or in respect of his or her religion, nor in the free exercise thereof within this province or islands thereunto. So it gave protection of Christians who acknowledged the Trinity. Life in the Chesapeake was perilous, full of disease. Most immigrants were single men. And then they got the opportunity when 90 tobacco brides were sent over to England. And these were 90 young single women. And they, most of them had lost their fathers. Some were were orphans. And they are going to be auctioned off as brides for 150 pounds of tobacco each. And all of them did become wives. They did say that they did have the right of refusal if they got somebody that they didn't really want. I don't know how true that was. But the region is eventually stabilized, and Virginia was the most populous colony by 1700, and Maryland was the third most populous. Philadelphia was the second. Okay, so it was a tobacco economy. First Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, and we think originally as indentured servants rather than slaves. The indentured servants were more prominent until the late 17th century. Okay, I'm going to go over this very quickly. We talked about the headright system. 3/4 of European immigrants that came to Virginia and Maryland came as indentured servants. A lot of the landowners turned their investments of labor into these huge estates, and most indentured servants never escaped poverty. So these plantations were huge. They went up the river valleys, and as they went far to the west, they were not given land, and when they tried to move out west, they were not protected. So they Berkeley did not want to protect them. He was actually trading with the Indians. Here we see Nathaniel Bacon confronting Berkeley, ultimately burning James. So he's leading the uprising, and for a moment they are successful, helped by other indentured servants, but then ultimately the rebellion will fail. Bacon dies of dysentery, and most of the rebels were killed. So this is the significance. The plantation owners now did not trust indentured servants anymore, and this is going to lead to more African slaves being brought in. Okay. Sorry. Folks in the West Indies, and some of the Barbados farmers come to the Carolinas, and they brought slaves with them, and they start growing rice as their main. The English Civil War kind of slowed things down for a little bit, and remember Oliver Cromwell, pro-Protestant, then King Charles I is going to take over, and these colonies that were settled after the Civil War are called the Restoration Colonies: North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania. Okay, so these are showing you. Carolina is going to be founded after the English Civil War, and their goals were to provide foodstuffs for the islanders. They exported Indian slaves to the West Indies and to New England, and rice was the production. Labor was intensive, and slavery grew dramatically. By 1719, there were more slaves than there were white people in these. Charlestown became the place where there were operas and aristocratic havens for others. And the Spanish just kind of kept bothering. North Carolina was a poorer area than the South Carolina. You can see that it was most And then finally we have Georgia, founded by James Oglethorpe, and he emptied the debtors' prisons, and it was a buffer between Spanish Florida and South Carolina. So this is the least populous of the 13 colonies, and there we have it.